Welcome to Just Liberty, where justice and liberty meet. I'm Bettina Krause, editor of Liberty Magazine, and my co-host is Alan Reineck, executive director of the Church State Council, and together we're trying to recover religious liberty from the political extremes. And I have a story to start our show off today, Alan, that really does test that goal of trying to recover religious liberty from the political extremes, because it's one that usually engenders a strong emotional response, and that's the issue of gender identity, especially in public school settings. So, Alan, you actually emailed me about a case you read about recently.
Sure. So this is a case coming out of a Massachusetts public school, and a middle school student. So what would that be? Maybe a 12-year-old from obviously a Christian family, wore a T-shirt to school that says there are only two genders. And he was sent home. He was told he had to take it off. He was sent home. He came back the next day and wore a T-shirt that said there are only censored. The two was crossed out, censored genders.
Right.
Suffice it to say that he was disciplined and required to take that T-shirt off. And the family sued the school district for violation of his free speech. And the district court ruled in favor of the school, which I think is remarkable. You know, in my very formative years, there was a case of black armbands, the Tinker case, very famous free speech case from the late 60s, protesting the war in Vietnam by wearing black armbands, right?
Right.
And the Supreme Court ruled that that was free speech and that the school could not prohibit it. So I don't know what's, I think the heading that I sent it to you was reminiscent of a book about free speech that I want to say Nixon speechwriter Anthony Lewis, longtime New York Times columnist, wrote, called Free Speech for Me but Not for Thee, right? So it's okay to have transgender friendly and LGBT friendly content or speech, but to have somebody speak their belief that is different, that's not permitted.
So, I mean, there's a couple of issues here, more than a couple, but two that come to mind is, first, how far do you think it is a problem of school districts not defining their policies clearly and helping students to understand those? Is it a case of just teachers, reacting, or is it a case of them implementing faulty guidelines? So, how far is it that problem? And the second issue is, isn't speech limited in school situations? There are more limits, right? A school-age child doesn't have an absolute free speech right within a school context. I mean, there are going to be time, place, and manner restrictions on how they exercise their speech, right?
Well, we're going to see how the courts, address that. The free speech stuff is not my expertise, in terms of the finer points of it. But I do think that the argument is going to turn in part on viewpoint discrimination.
Right.
So, if it would have been acceptable to have a T-shirt that says I support same-sex marriage, for example, but not a T-shirt that says there are only two genders, that is a preference for one viewpoint over another. So the school district clearly can't be biased against. Now, are they going to argue that, that this T-shirt was objectively offensive towards certain types of students? Well, we'll see how far they get with that.
Mm. I was talking with a public school teacher not long ago at an event I was speaking at, and her concern was that teachers are simply not given adequate direction from their school district. The guidelines are not in place. I mean, this is such a sensitive area. Very strong personal opinions enter into the equation. And yet most school districts are not doing their due diligence in outlining for teachers how they should handle these situations.
Well, then that really does need to change. I mean, the federal government gave, going back to the Clinton era, issued very, very good guidelines, for example, on religious expression in the federal workplace. And they were reiterated and, during the Trump administration. So it's certainly possible to do that. And clearly this is a kind of difficult issue that really needs to have very clear policies from the get-go.
Absolutely. Well, why don't we, on that note, move on to our interview for the day? And I think this one is going to be a really interesting discussion.
We are very pleased to welcome Dr. Michael Campbell, Director of Archives, Statistics, and Research at the North American Division of Seventh-day Adventists, formerly a religion professor at Southwestern Adventist University, professor of church history at the Adventist International Institute of Advanced Studies in the Philippines. Michael is also an ordained Adventist pastor, assistant editor of the Ellen G. White Encyclopedia, and a fellow podcaster, co-host of the popular podcast Adventist Pilgrimage. And our topic today, Michael, is to talk a little bit about the history of Adventist interest, commitment, involvement with advocating for religious freedom. I've often said I tell churches it's in our DNA. It's part of who we are. But, get us started here. Take us back to, how was it that Adventists first really kind of caught the light and the fire of advocating for religious freedom?
Yeah, glad to be here with you, Alan and Bettina, and what a great topic. So we're looking at our Adventist past. I mean, this religious liberty goes back to our DNA, to our very earliest beginnings. And I think really the best place to start is the fact that our early pioneers, all the way to the Millerites, were social reformers. They cared deeply about the world around them. And so they were tied up in a whole host of reforms, whether temperance to abolition. And really where we see this kind of seed of caring deeply, it's kind of ironic because they're waiting for Jesus to come. And yet, you might think, well, just write everybody off. Jesus is coming anyways. Actually, the more they believed Jesus was coming, the more they worked as activists to make a difference in the world around them. And so probably one of the most significant issues in the formation of our church had to do with slavery. And so our early pioneers were, for the most part, there's always an exception to something, but for the most part, the majority were ardent abolitionists. They cared deeply about that. And so during the heyday of the Millerite movement, you see there's this come outer movement where some of the mainstream churches that many of these people were a part of did not appreciate their views about abolition. They didn't appreciate their views about the second advent. And so kind of cast them out, said, hey, we don't want you part of us. And so that kind of DNA, waiting for Jesus to come and caring deeply about society and then feeling like you're kind of cast out, made our pioneers feel very deeply, care deeply about religious freedom and freedom of conscience, freedom and ability to be able to speak up and also to make sure that people have that opportunity to worship and to give people freedom, and not only for themselves, but think of those disenfranchised slaves, during the height of chattel slavery here in America and beyond. So that's kind of that context. And so religious freedom and caring about that is baked into the very earliest beginnings of our movement.
So what you're describing, Michael, really is a sort of a countercultural movement, a movement that's somewhat out of step with mainstream views on key social issues. But what about the idea of worshipping on a day that is different to the Protestant majority? Because that really was a visible marker, right, of this countercultural identity of Seventh-day Adventists.
Absolutely, Bettina. I mean, that's just a natural segue as our earliest pioneers, as they're wrestling and trying with their identity and understanding what happens next. They go back and studying the Bible. So there's this notion of present truth, a commitment to Scripture, a high view of Scripture, and that they need to continue studying the Bible. And it's in that pursuit of truth that they discover the seventh-day Sabbath, among other truths as well. You know, the work of Christ in the heavenly sanctuary and the whole apocalyptic understanding about how Christ is coming. That all is part of a crucible. And to be able, you're right, it's countercultural. It's not, they're not the majority by any stretch. And so it's kind of a little bit unusual. And so worshiping on the seventh day, that being not only just a different day upon which to worship, but that symbolizes and represents something very special, typifying God's people at the end of time who stand faithful for God, no matter what else may come. So that, again, Sabbath and all of these things kind of continue on in that vein. It doesn't change. Still that commitment. People should be allowed the freedom to worship on whichever day they want to, as well as freeing the slaves. I mean, it goes together. It goes together.
Well, but on a very pragmatic level, the National Reform Association in the latter part of the 1800s was pushing for Sunday legislation in various forums, and a couple of Adventist leaders began to both publish and even testify before Senate committees in opposition to
Absolutely.
Sunday laws. And that's really the founding of our publishing work in religious liberty going back to the 1880s, right? And Alonzo Jones, a prominent historian and preacher, testifying before the Senate saying, we don't want a Saturday law or a Sunday law. We think government should stay out of it, right?
Yeah, fabulous, because what you're describing is kind of that next stage, right? So the church kind of coalesces and forms in the middle of the Civil War. And so, at the 1880s is where you have the national Sunday law. And you need to, part of it is understanding that context. It's a time of a lot of turmoil and change in society and politics, big government and social reform. And how do they labor laws? And so they're trying to mandate things. So ostensibly for good purposes, right? Child labor laws, we would probably all agree that we don't want little children working in factories for, days, for terrible hours with hardly any sleep and hardly any wages, right? So those are some of the motivations. And in the midst of that, in the zealousness to kind of preserve some of what people saw as some of their values is this idea of Sunday. And so you have the Sunday legislation that's being pushed. And A.T. Jones of 1888 fame, Righteousness by Faith, all of this, he becomes kind of the star in Adventism that will testify before Congress. And, really, it's a shame. Nobody has done a proper treatment, in my opinion. Even my friend George Knight, who's written a biography of A.T. Jones, only has I think it's one chapter. It's 10% of the book. It's a very well-written chapter, but maybe somebody listening to this podcast will write a proper dissertation just on Jones and his contributions to religious liberty, because he's just out there on the front lines trying to let people know, hey, we're here, religious liberty, this is what this country's founded on. We should have the opportunity to worship as we please. And at the same time, that is the catalyst for other people saying, if we care about religious freedom for ourselves as Seventh-day Adventists, we should care deeply about the same rights, the same ability for people to have the freedom to choose. And I just want to point out that there's a theological underpinning here that's absolutely crucial. And that is our understanding of the great controversy, that if we have a God who loves us and gives us the freedom to choose, this is this Arminian theology, free will, free choice, then if God does that for us, we should extend the same kind of charitable kind of perspective and allowing other people the freedom to choose. So that's just kind of, again, baked into the DNA of our theology. But yeah, 1880s Sunday laws, it's kind of crazy.
Yeah. I hope someone takes you up on that idea of doing a proper biography of A.T. Jones, because I like to say, Alan says, it's part of our DNA, I like to say religious liberty attracts the flamboyant folk in our church history. A.T. Jones was a character. I mean, I think
He was.
I think there is ample material to really explore him as an individual. Another thing I like to say is that the Adventist Church punches above its weight in the issue of religious liberty. I mean, as working big time on Capitol Hill as a government affairs representative for the church, I mean, it is quite clear that our commitment to religious liberty and our ability to speak into that space is out of balance, really, with our numerical size in North America. As a historian, how do you account for that? I mean, are there institutional factors involved, or?
Well, I think it just goes back to our theology and then also developing systems that supported it, like the American Sentinel, which becomes the precursor of Liberty, which you edit, Bettina, So providing a venue for print, for publications, the dissemination of ideas, and not just within the denomination, but from the very beginning, it was also, this is about educating the wider public. And so it's kind of like a mission of our church. And so I think punching it above one's grade, but it's because the church feels so deeply and has invested so consistently in educating both the church and the wider public on these topics. And it does hit home. It does hit home because these are very relevant topics within us. We start looking in the 1880s, 1890s, people say, if I don't have religious freedom, then, there's a whole host of especially localized laws. We call them the blue laws, where Adventists started getting arrested for working on Sunday and then worshiping on Saturday. So there's a bit of tension, social tension that's going on. And as some church members, not a lot, but there were some, were facing these kinds of situations, it also generated a lot of media and coverage. What's going on here?
So speaking of the outsized influence of the Adventist Church and going back to the 1880s and 90s, Bettina, I don't know if you even are aware that the Adventist Church played a critical role in your home country of Australia, adopting protection for the free exercise of religion. And I learned that when our friend Professor Alan Brownstein, religious liberty advocate and law professor, did a sabbatical over in Australia, and he came back and told me all about the Adventist contribution to religious freedom in Australia back in the 1890s, when numerically we were practically not even a statistical blip.
So we Adventists were very active in Australia in making sure that our constitution didn't have an overtly religious flavor. And they lobbied for the exclusion of words relating to God and the Christian faith, which was, I think, a substantial contribution.
Interesting. I think there's something here, though, that's worth exploring, for just teasing out for just a minute. And that is in Australia, I mean, that's new to me, but not surprising, because when you look at missionaries in different parts of the world, I think of Anna and Fernando Stahl down in Peru. Right, their work was a part of a catalyst in providing religious liberty in that Latin American country, which is really quite phenomenal. So wherever missionaries go, they establish schools and health clinics, but there also is a part of this where, through their work in advocacy, you see religious liberty legislation that is the result, because they realize, hey, we really value how the work that they're doing. So we need to make sure that we protect those kinds of outreach kinds of efforts. So very, very interesting that you bring that up, Alan.
Well, one question I have for you, Michael, is where did our actual, structure of having religious liberty administrative positions begin? How far back does that go? Whether it's at a conference or a union or, some other level of church administration. We have the structure now that, but where did it come from?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and it goes back to the 1880s, and I think like what a lot of within our denomination, a lot of the organizations we have began through periodicals, right? And so I think the American Sentinel, that being part of it, is part of this. Part of the story. And then also you begin to actually organize a religious liberty department. And I probably should actually looked up the exact date. You guys may actually have it in front of you, but I know it's in the 1880s, 1893, I think. But anyways, that's a significant moment when both through print and then organizationally, and then when the General Conference restructures in 1901, 1903, you take these sort of quasi-organizations, like there's a Medical Missionary Benevolent Association, right, and a Tract Missionary Society, these different groups, they actually will be reorganized as departments of the General Conference. And so you see very early on, because this is during a kind of a crucial formative phase, that the church says this is a top priority of our denomination and needs to continue to be. So you see this kind of, again, with the structures, and as the structures change through the 20th century, it's still there. And it's because it's so important for our Adventist identity.
So, Michael, we're getting toward the end of our discussion, but I don't want to let you go before trying to kind of draw you into the 21st century. I know you're an historian, but I want you to weigh in on a cultural issue today and how that relates to our history as a church. We hear the term Christian nationalism talked about a lot these days.
Yeah.
And this idea that Christianity has a duty or a responsibility or a right to dominate culture through political means. Now, is there anything from our history as a denomination that helps us understand why we as Adventists have consistently rejected anything that sort of moves in that direction?
Yeah, absolutely. Because Ellen White talks about this in great controversy, that the potential of power when combined with religious authority, when those things come together, often that they can very easily be misused and abused. And so we see this throughout all of church history. We see this in our Adventist past in the beginnings, with the abolitionist efforts. We like to think, the abolitionists in the 19th century, they were the good guys, right? But the reality is, to have been a social reformer in the 1840s, 1850s was to stick out like a sore thumb, where even in the North, you would often be persecuted, right? So that combination, so our church has always recognized that we have to be very, very careful that our faith informs our politics, and then it's not our politics informing our faith. And so you see Ellen White, some people have this mistaken notion that our church pioneers were not political. They were highly political. They cared deeply about the world in which they lived and advocating for justice or against injustice, if you will. But what you find is that the pioneers, as they cared deeply about those issues, they wanted to make sure that they weren't partisan. In other words, they weren't beholden to a particular candidate or a party. They're making sure that their advocacy was really reflecting deeply their biblical values, their Adventist identity, the things that they cared about, and then allowing that to shape the world around them. And so what I see the danger of Christian nationalism is that people are equating their wider politics and these kinds of things based on a certain outlook or a certain origin story, where in reality, as Seventh-day Adventists, we've always held to this idea that we need to separate the two and be very careful that we're not taking our views and forcing them upon others. And the extent that we don't want that to happen, we expect the same from others. And that's where Christian nationalism becomes problematic. It just assumes a certain normative story that this is the way everybody should view the wider culture around them. And we have to be very careful in a world that where we have many, many different religious groups. So not only do we as Adventists care about our own religious freedom, we care about the religious freedom of other Christian groups, and we also care about the religious freedom of other non-Christian groups, because we're taking that principle of respecting other people's autonomy, their agency, and so that's part of who we are, and so we have to be very careful. We live in an age, and it hasn't really changed. There's always culture wars going on, different kinds of issues, and you can pick them over different decades and generations. We have them going on right now. But I think the best thing is that we need to be as respectful as we possibly can, both outside of the church and also within the church. We have disagreements going on, how we see things, different political leanings, for example. I've been a pastor long enough. I've had church members on both sides, and say, hey, it's okay that we disagree on some of these things, because when we come to worship on Sabbath, we can put our politics aside and not put other people down and say, I love Jesus, and I can see that you love Jesus, and right now that's the most important thing. And so that love for Jesus should transform and change the way we relate to one another and give each other a sense of mutual respect, especially when we disagree.
Well, Michael, thank you so much. That was an interview packed with all sorts of thought-provoking ideas. We really appreciate getting your expertise on the history of the Adventist Church's religious freedom commitment. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
What struck me the most, I think, Bettina, about this interview with Michael is the way that the Adventist Church could balance and integrate both a sense of the imminence of Christ's return and a very practical, present-day, real-world commitment to things like religious freedom, opposition to slavery, being part of the Underground Railroad, social justice kinds of things. That it wasn't, like James Watt in the Reagan administration was Interior Secretary, and he had a coherent approach that, we could drill for oil off the coast of California. It didn't matter what we did to the environment because Jesus was coming soon. It was an either-or approach. But
right.
Adventism seemed to have a both and. Yes, we can anticipate the immediacy of Christ's return and still be very much committed to these principles of freedom and justice in society.
And it was this idea of translating eternal values into the here and now, and beginning to reflect the values of the kingdom to come in the present day. And that's a tricky thing to pull off. I was reading an article not long ago about apocalyptic traditions, which those traditions which look to a future where the earth will end, where there will be these terrible apocalypse events, and they tend to not be engaged in the here and now. I mean, there is this impetus to sort of retreat from the world. But, the mandate of Christianity is to run into the world, to be involved in the world, and to reflect God's character through how we, conduct our lives.
Well, I would commend the listener to the last 2/3 of Jesus' own apocalyptic sermon, which is found in the Gospel of Matthew 24 and 25. Relatively small part of the sermon is devoted to what we would call last day events. And then he has a series of, I want to say, 6 parables about how we're supposed to live. And we're supposed to be good stewards over his household, taking care of things. And, we don't know the day or the hour. So we're all gonna be asleep, and like the virgins in the parable, until the bridegroom comes, and then we wake up. So I think that it's very instructive that so much of the sermon is carry on until I get there.
Absolutely. And on that note, let's wrap it up for today. This has been Just Liberty, where justice and liberty meet. I'm Bettina Krause with Alan Reineck. And until next time, remember, eternal vigilance is the price of liberty.